Anybody who doesn't have a written contract or does have a written contract but there's no indemnity election in it, then you're with me, you're in my club, and it's not a great club to be in for a principal. Compared to an indemnity payment, Regulation 17.6 is all that the regulations have to say about the calculation of compensation, which isn't really a lot. So it's been left to the courts of different member states to work out what that really means, and there's never been any guidance on the calculation issued by the Commission or any other body. And probably the most important point on compensation, compared to what Emma has just said, is that there is no maximum amount set. And in our experience, if you take the same agent and on one day you have to pay him an indemnity, and then the day after you'd have to pay him a compensation, you would always pay more for compensation than you would for indemnity. There is a big difference between the two. Now, the leading case in the UK on the calculation of compensation, or arguably, is Lonsdale, which went in the House of Lords in 2007. Before Lonsdale, there had been a lot of discussions about whether the UK should be effectively following what the French courts do. And what the French courts do is they take the last 3 years of gross commission, divide by 3 and times by 2, and from that very simple calculation you get what the compensation payment will be. But around about that time, lots of principals didn't like the idea of the French approach. They thought that the agents were getting too much under this approach, and so the case of Lonsdale came about, where the agent was effectively asking the House of Lords to approve the French approach in the UK, and the House of Lords thought about it and came back and said no. Effectively what they said was that the French approach didn't fit with English common law principles, particularly in relation to the assessment of the loss of profit, so they decided that in England, when looking at how much would be payable by way of compensation, you had to think about the amount that a hypothetical third-party purchaser would have paid for the business of the agency just before its termination. Now, the House of Lords thought that this was going to be very, very easy to assess, but outside of a couple of comments that didn't really go anywhere in the judgment, there were no actual fixed principles set out in Lonsdale saying what the assessment needed to be. So it's been left to the agents and the principals that have followed in the wake of Lonsdale to really sort out in the courts what it actually means. So now what happens in reality is that when you're looking at compensation, both sides engage their own expert accountants who has a look at the business of the agency and produces a report which values how much they think the compensation should be. Now, how much do you think two experts can disagree with each other? You would be surprised. In a recent case that Steve and I were working on, we had one expert for the agent who came up with a multiplier of 7, which resulted in a compensation payment in excess of £1 million. And then the principal brought forward their expert, who was using a multiplier of 2 and was coming in at under 200,000. Now that is a massive gap, and in a lot of cases that could be an insurmountable gap. Because if somebody genuinely thinks that they're going to get in excess of £1 million, somebody genuinely thinks that they should only be paying just under 200,000, any settlement discussions are going to go quite slowly. So there are a number of ways that experts use to calculate compensation. There are some favourites. The one that we find more usually involves a calculation of what's called net maintainable earnings, which is basically commission minus costs times by a multiplier, but there are other ways out there. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail because I don't have time and I don't think anybody would want to hear me. So basically I'm just going to look at a couple of headline points, which is kind of something to think about, and kind of, it sounds very negative to think about the end of an agency during an agency, but it's always useful to be kind of gathering information so that if you do ever need it, you can think back to something that somebody had said to you. So first is the treatment of the costs of the agent. Generally, most agents are going to have more than one agency. It's very unusual to find somebody with just one agency. But of the costs that they incur, they're going to share them across a number of different brands. When you're looking at the costs on a termination, how do you treat that? If I carry 5 agencies and my costs are 50,000, should the costs attributed to each agency be just 10,000? Or is it better to look at the commission turnover generated by each agency? Normally agents are going to have major agencies with minor agencies. So often, for example, if I've got 5 agencies, but one of the agencies, the agency that's terminated, was 80% of my turnover, is it more reasonable for 80% of the costs that I've incurred to be set off against my commission turnover? And that obviously results in a smaller number when you start to look to multiply it. Another area that can drive down the valuations is notional salary. Most agents don't pay themselves a formal salary. They're more likely to take the profits of the business at the end of the calculations for that year. But case law has developed where you can actually include an amount, you can deduct an amount for somebody to do the work that the agent's been doing. It is a good way of knocking off a big chunk of the amount to be paid, and particularly if you're engaging a sales representative to take on the work of the agent after the termination, when you look at the amount that you pay that person, it's a good indication as to what the agent who was taking on the agency would need to pay a person to do that work as well. The other point, which, as I was saying about our particular situation, makes a massive difference, it results in a big number or a very little number, is the multiplier that is applied to your net maintainable earnings figure. A couple of points to think about, and again, some of them do go back to what you put in your contract in the first place. Agencies that have restrictive covenants are more valuable than agencies that don't, because obviously if you have a restrictive covenant, the hypothetical third-party purchaser will know that the agent can't go into the territory the next day and start taking those customers and start selling something else to them. They have to keep out of the territory for a certain length of time. Again, the type of agency, an agency which is exclusive is more valuable than an agency where there are a number of different people who can act in the territory. Something that continues to be a big factor in multipliers is the prevailing economic climate of particular sectors, but obviously some products will kind of buck the trends in a particular area. Also as well, if you have an agency which is very dependent on one customer, that can also be something that drives down the multiplier, because if it's dependent on one customer and something happens to that customer, the value of the agency could be very much reduced very quickly. And then finally, there's the position of the principal. This was an issue in Lonsdale where the principal was effectively shutting down, so there was no real future value. But equally, you can have discounts where the principal is not the brand owner, because the principal's continuation of its business is also dependent on a third party. But I think with compensation, the overall message has to be that the situation, even 7 years after the leading case, is very, very uncertain. And it's for this reason that we continue, whenever we talk to people in the industry about this issue, to say, if you do nothing else in your contract, if you change nothing else in your contract, get an indemnity put in place, because you will always, always have the protection of knowing at any one time the maximum that you're going to have to pay. And because of that as well, if you do part company with your agent, you're going to have to pay people like us far less to argue with your agent about how much you're going to pay them to effectively bring everything to a close between you. So